Recording in progress. Okay, I'm gonna get my screen up. That looks good. Evan, nod. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. We're going to talk about energy performance and green development standards. So I guess, yeah, I'll open up with some opening content for this. I guess a little backstory, RWDI together with Sustainable Buildings Canada, we're currently partaking in a grant funded by TAF. Are you able to invite me or anything? Sorry, my colleague got kicked out. And we're participating in a grant, and that tool is called Compass for Municipalities. So this, it's almost like an information gathering session for me to be participating here. So I'm going to be presenting some content, and then really interested in gathering feedback and getting your folks' input on the subject. Very quickly, right off the bat, in terms of building code and how that plays into development in municipalities and how that kind of shakes out with building types. So you can kind of divide everything into part 9 and part 3 buildings, or at least this is my, as an outsider, as an energy modeler, my interpretation of this. I'm sure architects or others more familiar with the building code will probably be rolling their eyes or getting angry with what I'm saying. But in my head, this is how everything's divided up. Part 9 would be housing and small buildings, 3 stories or less and smaller than 600 square meters. And developments largely will follow the prescriptive path in terms of what they're doing with their enclosure and mechanical systems in order to demonstrate that they're meeting building code. And then part 3 kind of have as everything else. These developments will largely follow the performance path where they're going to be doing energy modeling. I think the reason for this deviation is that it's more cost effective to design a building to meet the building code following the performance path rather than following all the prescriptive requirements for a building. The relative size or kind of the market share of developments within a municipality will vary significantly depending on the size of the municipality. Some place like Toronto will, skew heavily towards the part 3 buildings. Smaller municipalities will probably be entirely part 9 or a lot of part 9. So there's, in a lot of the conversations kind of following, I think realizing or mentioning which we're thinking about, whether it's a part 3 or part 9 building, is important. The project that I'm working on and my background skews heavily towards the part 3, but I think it's important to have both components of that in the conversation. So just something to keep in mind. Quick energy modeling 101. So in order to demonstrate code compliance, we basically want to create a digital version of a building to see how it performs and how it runs. So you actually recreate the building, all the spaces within that building, the external geometry of what the building looks like, put in all your windows and doors and everything, apply what the insulation values you have everywhere, how performant your windows are, your roof. You assign the different space types to the spaces within that building. So, if you have office or residential, or it's just a hallway or restrooms or mechanical rooms, you kind of label each of the rooms and they'll have different configurations for some of these things that follow. So like default plug loads, if you've got an office space, you're going to have a lot of computers and desk lights and that sort of thing, versus a hallway, you're just going to have a little bit of lighting within that space. So kind of default filling in and occupancy schedules as well, how often it's going to be used, how many people are in that space. You set up all the mechanical and electrical systems. So, what type of mechanical systems are you going to have in a space? How efficient are they? Hot water heating, air conditioning, ventilation, all of that gets recreated in this digital recreation of the building. And then you plop it down in the climate and the region where the building is going to be placed, and you can run the simulation over the course of the year where the outside weather is fluctuating, the building is responding to this, there's people coming in and out, and at the end of the simulation you've got how much that building, as you've modeled it, and how much energy it'll use within a year. And so that's kind of one step. In order to demonstrate the performance difference, or that it's meeting building code, you take that building that you've done and you make another copy of it, and this time you maintain some of these things. So the shape of it, the spaces within it, that's all consistent. The occupancy schedules, obviously the climate that you're applying to it, that's maintained across the two models, but you will modify the enclosure and the mechanical systems to be the code version of that. So you've got these now two models with two results, and you can compare the performance of your proposed building versus the performance of the reference or the code building. So that's really energy modeling in a quick nutshell. Speaking about the project that I was mentioning earlier, it's building on an earlier project. So way back in 2017, I think we got funding from TAF to put together a pilot or kind of a concept, proof of concept about our idea. So right now, to demonstrate code compliance, there's all these consulting firms doing energy modeling for all of the part 3 buildings that are going up everywhere. They're simulating these buildings, using those results to prepare a report, and then submitting that to either planning departments, to the CAGBC for LEED certification, or to building departments to kind of get their code compliance stamps. But so all that effort goes in, like we're talking potentially weeks of work, 2 to 3, maybe a month of somebody developing this very detailed model of a building. But all of that gets summarized into a report that gets submitted, and then it checks the box, and nothing kind of happens with that underlying model. So RWDI, we thought, there's a lot of data within this, and there's a lot of value that could still be extracted beyond just demonstrating code compliance, and we should be doing something with that data. So the initial scripts that we put together just extracted all of that data, and it was kind of a command line interface. We later got funding from the IESO to make this an online tool where users can sign up, upload their models, and then get all of that data presented in a kind of cool, explorable charts and graphs and that sort of thing. And right now, we're trying to take that underlying technology and create something useful for municipalities. So, the city of Toronto's got this, but maybe Whitby or other places that have green development standards, if they wanted developers to submit their energy models through this tool, they would have a really good user interface to be able to explore those models and look at their full portfolio of buildings, of what type of buildings are going up, how performant is this proposed submission versus other submissions we've received, and that sort of thing. Have I covered everything on my list? Yeah, we can create a large database of all of the buildings being developed. I've just got, I guess, a couple of points of things to consider, potential things to spark people's ideas of what we'd like to talk about during this discussion. But again, thinking about what's common between Part 3 and Part 9 buildings. At the end of the day, I think we're all here to reduce carbon emissions, get to net zero buildings. So that's kind of a common underlying feature. But in terms of how developers go about submitting these applications, what data we have available for each of them, there's differences there. Metrics, how should we be tracking these things? So there's the energy usage, which can translate into greenhouse gas emissions. There's the cost of energy, which a lot of programs, they're, in order to incentivize, you're looking at dollars for energy. As I mentioned, getting to absolute targets. At the end of the day, I think we really got to be working towards net zero. So that's the ultimate end goal. But along the way from where we are now, instead of looking at relative performance from kind of that, performance relative to the code building, I think we should be working towards getting absolute targets and bringing those values down to get us to net zero. Sharing data and more interaction between planning departments and building departments. So, planning departments are trying to implement and review green development standards, and building departments are reviewing energy modeling reports for code compliance. But in conversation with various folks from municipalities, it seems like there's not too much interaction between those two groups, and they operate as separate entities, even though there seems to be, there should kind of be this overlap or transition and handoff from projects from one to the other. The idea of sharing data between municipalities. So right now, each municipality will have its own data set and have its own thing going on, but really being able to leverage data of, I guess just as an example, if there's a new performance arts center going up in Scugog or Hamilton, it would be really great for Hamilton to be able to look at all of the other performing arts centers that were put up in Oakville and Toronto and everywhere else. So how can we share data, and what data do we want to be sharing? That's really kind of the big question that's going to open up. I've spoken with NRCan and CanMed Energy, the folks there. They're really interested in, if we build up this big data set of building, detailed info from energy models on all the buildings being developed within the country, they'd really like to use that to look to develop their future codes and programs to see, what does the actual current building stock look like, and how to make informed data-driven decisions on how to update those programs and codes. And the last kind of talking point, I guess, the split incentive issue. So if you're going to build a more efficient building, the cost of that is going to land with the developer and the investors up front, and the benefits of those things will be felt by the people who end up owning the condos or living within them, or other buildings, by paying lower fees and having a more comfortable space. So how can we bridge that barrier of, the person paying for it isn't going to be the person enjoying the benefits of it necessarily? So I threw a bunch of things up on the wall, whatever interests people to talk about, you can go ahead. The two discussion questions that I think were sent out on the invite were, what data should we be collecting and sharing in order to advance green development standards? And how can we use this data to implement green development standards more effectively and maximize the carbon reduction benefits?
If folks want to use the raise hand function, we can definitely call on them if there's any thoughts. We could start with the first question. If anybody has any thoughts on that. Oh, seeing Jade.
Yeah, so Jade here, Tanner Whitby. So, now we're a year into our green standard. I'm also starting to think about reporting matrix, and politicians are asking us, what has the uptake been like? And I think, as other municipalities start to go down this road, some type of open data, or at least through municipalities, like sharing of number of applications or development applications received, the type, and the performance level in which, at the early development stage, the developer or the applicant is identifying to obtain. Because, one thing I think we have to consider with green development standards is a lot of applications take many years to go from a pre-consultation to shovels in the ground of construction. So a lot can change over that period of time. But it would be helpful, to allow us to have some kind of insight on benchmarking, and also have some kind of data. Most of us deal with the same big developers, regardless of what municipalities we're in. There's about 5 or 6 big developers that build in all of our communities. And we are not seeing a consistent application of energy performance across that jurisdiction. And it would help us have more teeth in trying to leverage bigger and better standards if there was more kind of open sharing.
Definitely a fan of open data, that's for sure. I've got Samuel.
Right. So for the first question, I was thinking about the CO2 equivalence and how, of course, we know, depending on how the electricity is generated that the building uses, the amount of emissions or CO2 equivalents from that electricity is going to vary greatly. So I think something to standardize or some data to collect and measure against would be those sort of marginal emissions factors, which I think the TAF looks at a lot. So that would be something to kind of collect and share to advance the green development standards, I think. I don't know if you have any comments to that, Chris, or others.
Yeah, that's a good point. Really interesting. I think the one benefit we do have of going from underlying data to draw up the carbon emissions is you can respond to changes in like you mentioned.
Right.
Okay, so a couple of different, I guess, issues with this. We actually did a bit of a white paper looking at the average versus marginal emission values
That's
for
right.
within building code. So there was the change, I'm not going to remember the year, but basically in the last OBC update, they switched from using the, okay, what's going to be, well, it switched from being the marginal emissions rate for natural gas to the average emissions rate for natural gas, I believe. So it dropped the factor of using natural gas by 8, I think. It used to be, it's down to 50 and it used to
Okay.
be 400. And yeah, the study that we even looked at, like, I don't know how detailed you want to get, but you can have time of use, basically, like what the IESO is actually running at any given hour to generate the electricity on the grid. Or like I said, you can be looking at average or yeah, the average over the course of the year. So I don't know if I've really got a strong stance on what the right answer is. If you're putting up a new building, should you
Right.
be assuming that this is all marginal? We're going to have to put up a new natural gas plant to power that building, or whether we should just be looking at the blended average of everything. But by going back and just looking at here's the building's electricity use and natural gas use, and then we can be updating if the blend is changing going forward, or just deriving the actual GHG emissions year on year. I think that's a benefit of what we're doing versus just taking a number of here's our building's greenhouse gas emissions and relying on a range of factors that people are using to drive that. Yeah, I think that's all I've got. Leon or Evan, if you wanted to add something.
No, I was just pointing to Leon actually too.
Okay, everybody's pointing. Okay, I have a question about capacity training for the energy modelers and people that are in particular at the municipalities. Generally, Part 9 buildings are modeled. Those houses are modeled by HOT 2000. Part 3 buildings are generally modeled with eQuest or CanQuest or something like that. There are a couple other products. And I'm wondering, especially from the municipal representatives, if you are finding that there's adequate knowledge about the energy modeling tools that are out there. Do your staff members, the building department people who have to review the submissions, the building submissions, have enough training? And what about the development community that you're serving? Are people knowledgeable enough about what they should be using, that there's a requirement to use it, or in the case of houses, a strong desire to use it, or is that an area that needs additional focus? So it's the training and skill development part of it is what I'd like to hear about from whoever's willing to jump in, especially municipalities. Anybody there?
I have my hand up. It's Edward. I mean, that's a very good point, Leon, and everyone on the call, is that, yeah, you might actually have this program and it might be prepared by professionals, but how do you get the information ultimately, and how does it adapt over time, and who accesses it is a good point, because yeah, part of it would have to be the training of staff. Anyone that would get access to this platform would need, I guess, some education of sorts, whether it's the planning and building department or any department really. So yeah, it might be great to collect all this information and share it, but how do you access it? And what skills do you need? I mean, I think that's a very good point. And I guess the other part of it, and maybe it's a question for Chris, is, and I think Jade made this observation, is buildings take years to plan, and then of course they take years of approvals, and the buildings do change over time. And so how does this program allow for that variability? That is, as you get new information, as the building changes from whatever 15 stories to 20 stories, how does that, how malleable is it, I guess is the question, as buildings do change. Thanks.
Sure. So I guess a few things. The underlying premise for the Compass for municipalities is to sort of address that training barrier and identifying that the kind of the premise of the project was that municipal planning departments, they don't have the expertise currently on hand to be able to take an energy model and open it, inspect it, verify that it's, the model was put together correctly, and then, comment on, how performant is the building, and is it meeting the requirements, whatever targets were set within the green development standard. That would be a challenge and would take a lot of resources that municipalities don't currently have. So the idea with the Compass tool is to kind of have a software solution where developers would upload their model to this tool, and that tool would do a high-level review of their submission to verify the building's performance and to provide some benchmarking on how that functions. And it would be, would require much less training. It would be training on how to use the tool and kind of interpret the results versus going full bore into energy model training and having to have the software to open the models and doing all of that. So the goal of the project is to heavily minimize the amount of training and kind of time that would take to review an energy model. And Edward, to your question or comment, I guess the only functionality that we do have is kind of having versions within a project. So you can receive an energy model at initial site plan or rezoning, even a model that's submitted at that stage. You can have a version there, and then you could kind of track it and update it. So you'd have multiple versions of the same project saying, here's what we had at rezoning, here's what we had at SPA. And then, if we get involved with the building department, you can have, here's your IFC drawings, the model that was prepared at that stage, or your as-built going right through. And so you could see how the performance of a building is changing as it moves through those stages.
I'm wondering, maybe as a supplement, Chris, is given that these models are supposed to be evaluated by municipal staff, usually in the building department, and you're commenting on the planning department, which is another division of the.
Sorry, Leon, I just got to jump in. I think we're about to be pulled out in about 5 seconds.
Oh.
So just as an FYI, to follow up.
Excellent. Thanks.
Oh, kind of expecting.
Not automatically getting yanked.
Apparently, we're not automatically being yanked back. So sorry, Leon. You finished your question. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, is there a need for cross training between the building department and the planning departments? Is this something that can be done internally? Is that something that TAF and or RWDI and or Sustainable Buildings Canada is looking at the process side of this, how that's going to work?
So I guess a few things I could say to that. Anecdotally, of a few folks that I've spoken to from building departments, they're taking the modeling reports that are coming in, and if they're signed off by a professional engineer, they're taking those as being accurate. And if they're saying that they're compliant, they're taking them as being compliant. So that's 3 more minutes before closing. Okay, that's not. Very anecdotally, that's what I've heard, is if they're getting a modeling report from a reputable consultant, then they're taking their word for it, and that's what they're doing. In terms of at municipalities, there's been some efforts to engage from the planning department to the building department side, and the building departments have kind of said we don't have the mandate to be reviewing anything beyond building code, and we don't have the time or the resources to be doing that to help you. So we'd love to, but sorry, we can't.
But the SB 10 that's associated with Part 3 buildings, the SB 12, which is the energy supplement to the Ontario Building Code, is now part of the building code. So therefore, does not that come under the purview of the planning department's responsibility? on one hand, and two is it sufficient that somebody just gives a thumbs up that they saw the report and there was a stamp on it, or don't they have to understand it? Don't they have to know what the implications are?
So I'm in the process of going from anecdotal evidence to engaging with the what is it, the OBOA, the Building Officials Association, to try to get a better sense of what their process should be, or kind of what they're thinking in terms of verifying energy performance in that, to get kind of a more holistic answer to what my anecdotal experience with that is. I think just yeah, Edward, go ahead.
Yeah, quickly, I would say that that anecdotal information is probably correct. Like even my job, for example, we're looking at FSRs, we're looking at shadow studies and wind and noise, and we cannot be experts at every study we look at. So of course, we have to rely on the experts to verify that the information is correct. I mean, that is a given. So that has to be factored in. Thanks.
Yeah, on the kind of other extreme, or the most progressive case would be the Toronto Green Standard, where they do have a few folks that work there. They're funded through development charges, this department, where they do receive energy models and they do dive in there, and they're running them themselves and verifying that things are modeled correctly and that they're meeting the targets they say they're meeting. And with a SPA submission, you'll receive comments back of you didn't model this correctly, or explain where you got these values from and how you're modeling this. So there is that is possible. It's just, is that going to work in Brock or wherever, where you've got a department of 1 or 3 people? That becomes the really big challenge.
If I may jump in on this, I think I have to echo the comments around, like, we cannot expect our planning and our building staff to be experts in everything. And I think the rigor in building capacity across the development community is relying on those third-party experts to be able to complete the work, and then for us to be able to simply sign off. And the reason I think our green standards took this approach is because it does mirror the requirements of other reporting, like whether it be transportation or urban design or natural heritage. Like, this is exactly the process we take. We have experts prepare the reports, and our planning team signs off to say it's been received and it meets the requirements. I think it's unreasonable to expect everyone who's involved in the planning process to be an expert in energy modeling. I think it would create more of a burden than it would be success.
I'm just going to jump in. It's been a great discussion. I hate to close it off, but we are going to get pulled, more like yanked, out of this room in a second. So for 20 seconds, I just want to thank Chris for the presentation, the great comments and questions. And I encourage everyone to follow up if you have direct questions and comments to each other to continue the conversation. And hope to see everyone at the next one. But again, thank you to everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now as well.